This is the Autism and the Structure of Reality series. This is part 12. The Lord's Prayer, Orientation, Attention, and the Ordering of Reality. In the last episode, we explored the idea that every transformation contains a funeral. We explored grief, forgiveness, release, the burden we refuse to put down, and perhaps the most difficult realization of all, that sometimes the thing standing between us and transformation is not a lack of knowledge, not a lack of opportunity, not a lack of ability, but the burden we have mistaken for ourselves. And if the previous episodes were about putting something down, then this episode begins with a different question. Now what? Because human beings cannot live without orientation. We cannot live without values. We cannot live without attention. We cannot live without a hierarchy. Something always sits at the top. Useful questions could be, what do you mimic? What do you idolize? What do you want to be? Something is always guiding our attention. Something is always guiding perception. Something is always guiding behavior, and something is always guiding our identity, even if we are completely unaware of it. One of the most common assumptions in modern life is that people simply see reality as it is. But that has never been true. Human beings do not merely perceive reality. We interpret it and organize it. We assign value to it. We determine what matters and what does not. We can decide where to place our attention. How often is that true? And from those decisions, entire lives emerge. Carl Jung understood this. He saw people becoming possessed by identities that were never questioned. He saw people mistake the ego for the whole self. He saw people spend their lives organized around structures that once helped them survive, but no longer helped them live. And Kierkegaard understood this. He saw people trapped between who they were and who they could become. He saw people longing for transformation while simultaneously fearing it. He saw people standing at the threshold of possibility and retreating because freedom felt terrifying. And Nietzsche understood this. He saw people worshiping things they never consciously chose to worship: status and approval, power, security, resentment. He understood that every person has a hierarchy of values, whether they recognize it or not. And Dostoevsky understood this. He saw people becoming organized around suffering. Raskolnikov and the Underground Man and Ivan and Alyosha's relationship. Around differences, around wounds, around old stories, around old identities and characters. He saw how easily the burden becomes the self. And Jesus understood this too, perhaps differently than any of them. Because when his followers asked him how to pray, he did not begin with requests. He did not begin with needs or desires or explanations. Instead, he began with orientation. And that should immediately strike us as strange, because if prayer were merely asking for things, this would be a very unusual way to begin. Think about that order, not the words, the order, because order matters, especially when we are talking about consciousness and attention and transformation. The prayer begins with Our Father, then hallowed be thy name, and then thy kingdom come. And then, thy will be done. Only after those things does the prayer arrive at daily bread. And only after those things does the prayer go to forgiveness. And then it goes to temptation. Why? Why this order? Why not start with the daily needs? Why not start with suffering? Why not start with fear? Why not start with the temptation or forgiveness? Why begin here? Remember the order of the 3 temptations. Stick to the mission. Stick to the objective. I think the answer is profound because the Lord's Prayer is not merely a prayer. It is a hierarchy, an orientation, a way of organizing consciousness, a way of organizing our attention and our value, a way of organizing the self. The entire Autism and the Structure of Reality series is talking about the self. Who are you? And why are you you? As a self. Remember the origins of the word autist, autistic. Autism is autos, like automatic, automobile. AUTOS. And this means self. What does the self orient towards? What is the self becoming from the places you send your attention? And maybe most importantly, who are you becoming? And perhaps that is why this prayer has survived for nearly 2,000 years. Not because it tells people what to think, but because it helps people orient themselves toward reality. And perhaps nowhere is that more obvious than the very first words, Our Father. The prayer begins with 2 words that are so familiar that most people never stop to think about them. Our Father, not my Father, not me, not I, not my needs, my fears, my goals, or not my desires, but our Father. Human beings become psychologically ill when the self attempts to occupy the place that only the highest value should occupy. Jung might describe this as ego inflation. The ego begins believing it is the whole personality. It becomes the center around which everything else revolves. But Christianity begins somewhere very different. Before asking for anything, the prayer immediately decentralizes the ego. Get behind me, Satan. Our Father, the self is not removed. The self is properly situated. And I think there is something profoundly important happening here, because the prayer immediately challenges one of the deepest assumptions of modern life. The assumption that the self is the center. Modern culture is obsessed with the self. Find yourself and express yourself. Protect yourself, promote yourself, define yourself, build your identity, construct your brand, create your image. Remember the first 2 temptations, living impulsively or reactively and turning the stone into bread. Remember the second temptation and what we discussed about social media. Post all your good deeds on social media. Look at me. This is the look at me movement. It's not a good situation. Everybody, look at what I have done. Everything points inward. Everything points toward the individual. Everything points toward the ego. And yet the prayer begins by immediately removing attention away from the self. Not eliminating the self, orienting the self. Placing the self inside something larger, a relationship, a community, a belonging, and participation. Jung spent much of his career warning about the danger of the ego mistaking itself for the whole, as in the whole self. The ego is important. It's necessary even, but the ego is not the entire self. And one of the great psychological mistakes human beings make is assuming that their immediate preferences, feelings, desires, and narratives are synonymous with reality. Jung saw this repeatedly. People become possessed by their identities, possessed by their stories, possessed by their grievances, possessed by their self-concepts, and eventually they lose sight of anything beyond themselves. I think this is one reason loneliness has become such a profound problem in modern life. Not because people are physically alone. Many people are surrounded by others, connected digitally to thousands and thousands of people, endless amounts of people, yet deeply isolated, because connection is not merely proximity. Connection requires participation in something larger than oneself. And this is where I think the opening of the prayer becomes surprisingly radical. The first movement is not toward individuality. The first movement is toward relationship. Our Father. Not isolation, relationship. Not separation, relationship. Not ego, but a relationship. Remember the first beatitude. You surrender yourself. You admit you are poor in spirit and you need help. You can't do this. Remember, we parsed out the word confidence in the part 7 with the blessed are the poor in spirit. Kierkegaard saw something similar. He believed that one of the great tragedies of modern life was the individual's loss of authentic relationship, not merely with others, but with reality itself. The self becomes trapped inside itself, circling itself, thinking about itself, analyzing itself, defending itself, until eventually it loses contact with something larger, something transcendent, something beyond its own immediate preferences. And perhaps this is where the prayer begins, not with information, not with doctrine, not with request, but with a reminder. You are not alone. You are not the center. You are not self-created. You are part of something larger than yourself. And that realization matters because the way we answer the next question determines everything that follows. If the self is not the center, then what is? If the ego is not at the top, then what belongs there? And that brings us to the next line. Hallowed be thy name. The most reliable thing the human being does is limit itself. Why? Because we make lower things sacred, like comfort, approval, certainty, identity, fear. Those become the ceilings of our lives. Then say, we rarely rise above what we worship. Hallowed be thy name may be one of the most misunderstood lines in the entire prayer, because most people hear it and immediately think respect, reverence, worship. And while those ideas are certainly present, I think something deeper is happening. The question hidden inside this line is, what is sacred? Or perhaps even more directly, what sits at the top of your hierarchy? Because every human being has a hierarchy. Remember, what do you mimic? What do you idolize? Who are you becoming? What do you want to become? Every human being is like this, whether they are religious or not, whether they acknowledge it or not. Something always occupies the highest position. Something always determines what matters most. Something always organizes the rest of life beneath it. Nietzsche understood this better than almost anyone. Although he is often remembered for criticizing religion, much of Nietzsche's work is actually about value. You have to understand his perspective and his time, his settings, whenever he announced God is dead. And then what happened shortly after in European countries? World War I, World War II. Nietzsche announced God is dead, and he gave a prophecy. What do people worship? What do they organize themselves around? What do they treat as sacred? What ultimately governs their decisions? Because whether a person believes in God or not, they still orient themselves around something. For most people, it's money. For others, it is status, or it is approval, or it is power, or it is security, ideology. For others, it is resentment. And for others, it is fear. Something occupies the center. Something always functions as the highest value. And modern psychology says something remarkably similar. We now know that the brain is constantly assigning value. We covered that pretty good detail in the Internal Calculators series. Constantly prioritizing, constantly determining what deserves our attention, what deserves effort and protection, and what deserves pursuit. The mind is always constructing a hierarchy. Always. This is where I think the prayer becomes extraordinarily sophisticated. Because before it addresses behavior, before it addresses temptation, before it addresses forgiveness, before it addresses daily needs, it asks a more fundamental question. What deserves ultimate value? Think about how much suffering emerges when the wrong thing occupies the top position. When status becomes sacred, when approval becomes sacred, when being right becomes sacred, when resentment becomes sacred, and when fear becomes sacred, when identity becomes sacred, everything beneath it begins reorganizing around that choice. The hierarchy shapes perception. Perception shapes behavior. Behavior shapes character. And character shapes destiny. Part 8 taught us that repetition builds character, but repetition does not happen randomly. Repetition follows value. We repeat what we value. We pursue what we value. We protect what we value. We become what we value. And perhaps that is why the prayer begins here. Because before we can understand who we are becoming, we must first understand what we have decided is worthy of becoming. Jung might say that every psyche organizes itself around a center. Nietzsche might ask whether that center is worthy. And Jesus begins the prayer by directing attention to the highest possible value, not self, not status, not power, and certainly not approval, but something beyond all of them. Because whatever occupies the highest place in the hierarchy eventually determines the direction of the entire life. Jesus never says, "Do you know him?" He always says, "Does he know you?" Understand that direction. And that naturally raises another question. If we know what sits at the top, where does the hierarchy lead? What future does it create? What direction does it produce? And that is exactly where the prayer goes next. Thy kingdom come. Our default as humans is go. G-O, go. To seek, to pursue. But go where? And seek what? If hallowed be thy name, ask what sits at the top of your hierarchy. Then the next line asks a different question. Where does the hierarchy lead? Or perhaps even more directly, what future are you building? Because values do not remain abstract. Value becomes action, and action becomes habit. Habit becomes character. Character becomes trajectory. And that trajectory becomes destiny. And this is one reason I think the word kingdom is often misunderstood. Most people hear kingdom and immediately think of a place, a location, a distant future, something that arrives someday. But what if kingdom is also direction? What if kingdom is orientation? What if kingdom is the future that emerges from what we repeatedly value? And part A was built around the idea that repetition builds character. Every repeated action trains something. Every repeated thought trains something. Every repeated avoidance trains something. And every repeated act of courage trains something, whether we realize it or not. We are always becoming someone. The question is, who? Nietzsche spent much of his life wrestling with this question. One of the most famous ideas was, become who you are. A strange phrase, almost paradoxical. How do you become what you already are? Because Nietzsche understood something important here. Human beings are not static. They are always becoming, always moving, always evolving, always constructing themselves through repeated choices. And Kierkegaard saw something similar. For him, the self was never a finished object. The self was a process, a relationship, a becoming. The self exists between what it is and what it could become. And that gap creates both anxiety and possibility. This is why I think that kingdom come is such a fascinating line, because it immediately shifts attention toward the future. Not fantasy and not wishful thinking, a future trajectory, a direction, the consequences of repeated choices. Think about modern life for a moment. Many people spend enormous amounts of energy reacting to the news, reacting to your social media, reacting to crises, reacting to emotions, and reacting to whatever appears directly in front of them. But reacting and orienting are not the same thing. When tempted to turn the stones into bread, Jesus does not react. He orients himself towards his mission. His time has not yet come. But reacting and orienting are not the same. And reaction responds to the moment. An orientation creates a future. And perhaps that is what this line is asking. Not, what do you want right now? What future are your actions creating? What kingdom is emerging from the things you repeatedly practice? What kingdom is emerging from your values and from your habits and from your attention? The answer may not be the future you claim to want. It may be the future your behavior is quietly building. And those are not always the same thing. Rarely, you could say, they are the same thing. This is where I think the prayer becomes remarkably practical. Because before it addresses temptation, before it addresses forgiveness, before it addresses daily needs, it asks, what direction are you moving? What future are you building? What kingdom are you creating? And that naturally leads to another problem. Because even if we know what we value, even if we know the future we want, we still encounter reality. And reality has a way of disrupting our plans. Reality disagrees with us. Reality frustrates us. Reality refuses to conform to our preferences. Which brings us to perhaps the deepest line in the entire prayer. Thy will be done. I think this may be the most psychologically profound section of the entire prayer, because almost every human being eventually encounters the same problem. Jesus himself says, not my will, but yours. That is the entire episode. That's alignment. The entire prayer culminates there. Not because Jesus lacked desire, but because reality was placed above preference. That is unbelievably powerful. You don't have to preach it. Just point out the symmetry. The prayer teaches the orientation. The garden demonstrates the orientation. That is beautiful because reality does not always cooperate. We want one thing. Reality provides us another. We plan one future. Reality creates a different one. We expect one outcome. Reality delivers something else. And the collision between preference and reality produces enormous suffering. Think about how many of our struggles begin here. I wanted this relationship. Reality ended it. I wanted this career. Reality took a different turn. I wanted this outcome. Reality chose otherwise. I wanted life to unfold one way. Reality unfolded another. Now, this does not mean that desire is bad, or that goals are bad, or the ambition is bad. The issue is deeper. The issue is alignment. Kierkegaard understood this. Much of his work revolves around the tension between the self's preferences and reality itself. He saw people trapped in despair, not merely because life was difficult, but because they refused to accept what it was. They remained attached to what they wished reality would be. And the gap between those two differences, those two things, became suffering. Dostoevsky saw this too. The underground man spends much of his life fighting reality, arguing with reality, resenting reality, demanding that reality operate according to his preferences. And he suffers because of it. Not because reality is cruel, but because reality refuses to negotiate. Jung saw something similar in individuation. A person cannot become whole while living entirely inside fantasy. A person cannot become whole while remaining attached to illusions. At some point, reality must be confronted. At some point, reality must be accepted. At some point, the self must align itself with what is. And this is where I think this line is often misunderstood. Many people hear, "Thy will be done," and imagine passive submission, obedience, resignation, giving up. I don't think that's what's happening here, not primarily. I think something much profound is happening. The prayer is not asking reality to align with us. The prayer is asking us to align with reality. That is a very different thing because alignment is not surrendering agency. Alignment is seeing clearly. Alignment is recognizing what is actually there. Alignment is working with reality instead of endlessly fighting it. This is the metaphor. This is the analogy of the light in the Bible. Shine a light on it and understand the truth. Think about how much energy human beings spend arguing with reality, arguing with the past, with the loss, with change, with consequences, arguing with things that have already happened. And no amount of arguing changes them. The previous episode explored mourning. We also talked about mourning in the Beatitudes episode, part 7. And one reason mourning is so important is because mourning allows reality to replace illusion. This is emotional depth. This is allowing yourself to go inside, deep inside of who you are, to understand yourself. Mourning allows us to stop arguing with what has already happened. And mourning allows us to align with reality. Perhaps that is why humility appears so often throughout this series, throughout the Bible. Humility is not thinking less of yourself. Humility is seeing clearly. Humility is accepting reality. Humility is accepting that reality does not revolve around your preferences. This is the first beatitude, humility, a poor in spirit. That is the gate of self-awareness. Remember, change could come from a two-part process: self-awareness, then self-acceptance. This is the first part. And that realization is not meant to diminish us. It is meant to free us. Because once we stop fighting reality, we can finally begin working with it. And after asking us to consider our relationships, our values, our future, and our alignment with reality, the prayer suddenly becomes much more immediate, much more practical, much more present. Because after all of those larger questions, Jesus turns attention toward a single day. Not next year, not 10 years from now, not yesterday. Give us this day our daily bread. Modern humans live in yesterday and tomorrow and elsewhere, and in algorithms, notifications, and predictions. Jesus keeps bringing attention back. Today, attention is where life happens. After discussing values, after discussing the future, after discussing alignment, the prayer suddenly becomes very small, very immediate, and very ordinary. Give us this day our daily bread. And I think this is one of the most overlooked transitions in the entire prayer. Because after speaking about the largest questions imaginable, Jesus suddenly brings attention back to today. And that is surprisingly difficult for human beings because much of modern life is spent somewhere other than the present. Some people live primarily in the past, replaying old conversations, revisiting old injuries, reconstructing old mistakes, reliving old regrets. Others live almost entirely in the future. They attach their identity to those previous moments, those previous experiences. Others live almost entirely in the future, simulating possibilities, predicting threats, preparing for outcomes that may never arrive, planning and worrying, anticipating and catastrophizing. The mind is constantly moving, constantly calculating, and constantly projecting. In many ways, this is exactly what the brain evolved to do. Remember thoughts. We talked about thoughts in quite detail. Remember, thoughts are a component of planning, and planning is a component of executive functioning. And executive functioning is a component of how humans sustain our species. There's an infinite good in that and an infinite bad. That's a steep gradient. The human nervous system is a prediction machine. It is always trying to anticipate what comes next, always trying to reduce uncertainty, always trying to prepare for the future. That capacity can be incredibly useful, but it can also become a trap because eventually a person can spend so much time living in yesterday and tomorrow that they stop inhabiting today. For many autistic individuals, this tension can become particularly visible. The same system that allow deep analysis can also create prolonged loops of thought. A conversation can continue long after it ends. A problem can remain active long after everyone else has moved on. A future possibility can be simulated hundreds of times before it ever arrives, especially in visual thought. Seeing the movie, seeing it play out identically to reality. The mind continues working, continues calculating, continues predicting. And while those abilities can be considered strengths, they also can make presence difficult. Kierkegaard saw this too. He wrote extensively about anxiety. And while modern psychology often treats anxiety as a disorder, Kierkegaard saw something deeper. He saw anxiety as a relationship with possibility, the self becoming consumed by futures that have not yet arrived, living in possibilities rather than realities, living in tomorrow rather than today. And perhaps that is why this line appears exactly where it does. Because after asking us to orient ourselves toward reality, Jesus immediately brings us back to the present. Daily bread, not yearly bread, not lifelong bread, daily bread. Remember, bread is not just food. That is not what he is discussing. This is profound humility hidden in that phrase. The future matters, planning matters, direction matters, but life is lived one day at a time, one conversation at a time, one choice at a time, one action at a time, and one moment at a time. And when we explored repetition, building character, and we talk about habits and so forth, repetition can only occur in the present. You cannot act yesterday. You cannot act in the future. You can only act now. And perhaps this is why attention matters so much. Because wherever attention goes, life follows. There are 2 verses in the Sermon on the Mount. I think the reader just blows by. They read it and they just keep going. Matthew 6, verse 22 and 23. This is about attention. The eye is the lamp of the body. So if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? This is about where you send your attention. You can only act now. And perhaps this is why attention matters so much, because wherever attention goes, life follows. The prayer does not deny the future. It simply refuses to abandon the present. And that naturally leads to another problem. Because even when we remain present, we still carry things, old injuries, old resentments, old debts, and eventually every human being encounters the same question. What do I do with the things I continue carrying? Forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors. We previously explored mourning and release. This may be the line that brings those ideas into daily life. Because every human being carries debts, not merely financial debts, psychological debts, emotional debts, relational debts, unfinished stories, unresolved injuries, old grievances, old wounds, things we continue carrying long after the event itself is over. Forgiveness is also refusing to let the past continue dictating the future. One of the most fascinating things about human beings is that we often continue paying for experiences that ended years ago. The betrayal happened years ago. The rejection happened years ago. The argument happened years ago. The humiliation happened years ago. And yet the mind continues making payments every day, every week, every year. The event is over. The debt remains. We proposed a different way of thinking about forgiveness in the last 2 episodes. Not approval, not pretending, not forgetting, release. The decision to stop carrying tomorrow what should have been left behind yesterday. The decision to stop making payments on a debt that can never be collected. Nietzsche understood the destructive power of resentment. He saw how anger can become organized into identity, how an injury becomes a story. The story becomes a worldview, and the worldview becomes the self. The person no longer carries the resentment carries the person. Dostoevsky saw the same thing. Again and again, his characters return to old wounds, not because they enjoy suffering, but because suffering has become familiar. The injury becomes identity. The burden becomes identity. The known self feels safer than the unknown self, even when the known self is suffering. Jung would likely describe these as complexes, psychological structures that organize attention and perception. Old experiences continue shaping present reality, not because they are still happening, but because they are still being carried. And perhaps this is why forgiveness appears in the middle of the prayer, because orientation becomes impossible when the past continues occupying the present. You cannot move freely while carrying everything. Eventually, something must be released. Eventually, something must be surrendered. Eventually, something must be forgiven. We call these things heavy emotions in the last 2 episodes. These are heavy in the body. But notice something else. The prayer does not stop with, "Forgive us our debts." It immediately continues, "as we forgive our debtors." That is fascinating psychologically, because it suggests that release is not merely something we receive. It is something we practice, something we become, something we embody. The person you refuse to forgive may not be suffering from your resentment. You are. You are carrying it. You are paying for it. You are investing energy into maintaining it. And eventually, the resentment becomes heavier than the original story and the original injury. Perhaps this is why forgiveness is so difficult, because forgiveness requires surrender. And surrender feels like loss or weakness, which brings us directly back to the past 2 episodes. Every transformation contains a funeral, and forgiveness is often one of those funerals. And yet, even after release, another challenge remains. Because human beings are constantly pulled away from what matters, constantly distracted, constantly tempted, constantly captured by lower values. Which brings us back to the question we first explored in part 6. What owns you? The 3 temptations. So the next line in the Lord's Prayer, "Lead us not into temptation." At first glance, this line seems straightforward. Lead us not into temptation. Protect us. Most people hear it and immediately think about morality, good choices, bad choices, rules, behavior. And certainly those things are involved. But after everything we explored in part 6, I think temptation runs much deeper, because temptation is not simply about behavior. Temptation is about ownership. One of the central ideas of part 6 was that every temptation begins with a promise of relief, a promise of certainty, a promise of pleasure, a promise of status, a promise of power, a promise of control. The temptation always offers something. That is why it is tempting. Think about the 3 temptations in the wilderness. Turn stones into bread. Throw yourself from the temple. Take the kingdoms of the world. At first, they appear completely different, but underneath them lies the same question. What will own your attention? What will own your value system? What will determine your actions? What sits at the top of your hierarchy? And that question is just as relevant today, because modern life is filled with temptations, not necessarily because people are worse, but because the competition for attention has become relentless. Every device, every platform, every advertisement, every notification, every outrage, every headline, every algorithm competing for the same thing: attention. The modern economy is, in many ways, an economy of attention. And wherever attention goes, value follows. Wherever value goes, behavior follows. Wherever behavior goes, character follows. And wherever character goes, destiny follows. This is why temptation is not simply about isolated decisions. Temptation is about direction. because every temptation quietly asks, what matters most? What are you willing to trade? What are you willing to sacrifice? What will you place above your highest values? It's a reordering of life. Nietzsche understood this. Although he used different language, he repeatedly explored what happens when lower values begin governing higher ones, when immediate gratification begins replacing meaning, when comfort begins replacing growth, when approval begins replacing truth, when security begins replacing becoming. Jung saw something similar through the concept of possession. A person becomes possessed whenever something takes control of consciousness, an emotion, an impulse, a resentment, a fear, a desire. The person believes they are making choices freely, but in reality, they are being driven by forces they no longer recognize. Perhaps this is why temptation appears near the end of the prayer, because temptation is ultimately a threat to orientation, a threat to alignment, a threat to the hierarchy established at the beginning. If hallowed be thy name ask, what is your highest value? Then temptation ask, what are you willing to abandon that value for? Part 6 asked, what owns you? And I think that question belongs here too, because every temptation is in some sense a bid for ownership, something competing for your attention, competing for your values, competing for your behavior, competing for your future. The question is not whether temptations exist, they always will. The question is whether we recognize them, whether we understand what they are offering, and whether we understand what they are costing. Because every temptation has a price. Sometimes the price is obvious. Sometimes it is hidden, covert, but the price is always there. And that brings us to the final line, a line that may summarize the entire prayer, a line that may summarize the entire series. Deliver us from evil. I think this line is often misunderstood because when many people hear the word evil, they immediately imagine villains, monsters, criminals, the devil, Satan, history's worst people. And certainly, evil includes those things. But if we stay within the themes of this series, I think evil is something broader, something closer, something more personal, more covert. Throughout this series, we have explored fragmentation, the divided self, the conflicted self, the self that knows one thing and does another, the self pulled in opposite directions, the self trapped between values, the self trapped between identities, the self trapped between who it is and who it could become. Jung spent much of his life exploring exactly this problem. His entire project was aimed at integration, wholeness, and alignment, bringing fragmented parts of the psyche into relationship with one another, not eliminating them, integrating them, because fragmentation has a cost. The fragmented self exhausts itself. The fragmented self contradicts itself. The fragmented self loses direction, and the fragmented self loses coherence. Kierkegaard described this fragmentation as despair. Part 9 covered Kierkegaard and the gap, the self divided against itself, the self refusing itself, the self disconnected from what it could become. Nietzsche saw fragmentation whenever people claimed one set of values but lived according to another, whenever ideals and actions drifted apart. whenever life became organized around contradiction. Dostoevsky saw fragmentation in nearly every major character he wrote. People torn between competing identities, competing desires, competing loyalties, competing stories. Much of their suffering emerged from that division. And perhaps this is why I think evil, at least in part, can be understood as something that pulls us away from alignment. Anything that corrupts perception, anything that fragments the self, anything that disconnects us from reality, anything that separates us from what is true. Because every line of the prayer has been moving in the opposite direction, toward relationship, toward value, toward purpose, toward alignment and presence, toward release, toward freedom from temptation, toward wholeness. The prayer begins by orienting the self, and it ends by protecting that orientation, protecting it from fragmentation, protecting it from corruption, protecting it from losing its way. When we step back and look at the Lord's Prayer as a whole, something remarkable emerges. It's not merely a list of requests. It's not merely a religious ritual. It's not merely a set of words to recite. It is an architecture, a hierarchy, a map, a way of organizing consciousness itself. It begins with relationship, our Father, because the self is not the center. It moves to value. Hallowed be thy name, because something always occupies the highest position in our hierarchy. It moves to direction. Thy kingdom come, because value creates future. It moves to alignment. Thy will be done, because reality does not reorganize itself around our preferences. We must learn to align ourselves with reality. It moves to presence. Give us this day our daily bread, because life is lived in today, not yesterday, not tomorrow, but today. It moves to release. Forgive us our debts, because transformation requires putting things down. It moves to temptation, because lower values are always competing for ownership, always competing for attention, always competing for control. And it ends with protection from fragmentation. Deliver us from evil, because a life cannot remain aligned if it becomes divided against itself. Perhaps that is why the prayer has survived nearly 2,000 years, not because it tells people what to think, but because it addresses some of the deepest problems of human consciousness, the same problems Jung explored, the same problems Kierkegaard explored, the same problems Nietzsche explored, the same problems Dostoevsky explored, the same problems every single human being eventually encounters. The problem of value, the problem of attention, the problem of identity, the problem of suffering, the problem of temptation, the problem of transformation, the problem of orientation, the problem on where to go and what to become. And perhaps that is why the Lord's Prayer is not merely a prayer. It is a hierarchy of attention, a way of organizing value, a way of organizing action, a way of organizing identity, a way of aligning the self with reality. Perhaps after everything we have explored throughout this series, that is what transformation has been pointing toward all along. Not simply becoming different, but becoming aligned. If you're listening to the podcast, listening to the episode, please feel free to leave a review or rating. In podcasting, reviews, ratings, and downloads are huge, and I very much appreciate your feedback. You can contact me on X at RPS47586. You can email me, info.fromthespectrum@gmail.com. You can check out the YouTube page for full-length videos, shorts, and clips. You can subscribe, but I'm going to tell you, I don't necessarily care about that. I just want you to see the information. Thank you for listening to From the Spectrum podcast. If you're raising a child with autism, you've probably experienced the confusion that comes with trying to make sense of it all. One expert says one thing, another says the opposite. And social media is full of opinions. Every week there's a new therapy, a new program, a new approach claiming to be the answer. And somewhere in the middle of all of this noise, you're trying to figure out what's actually best for your child. That's why I recommend Lynn R. Curry and Elevate How You Navigate. Lynn is the father of an autistic son, host of the Autism Parenting Secrets podcast, and someone who understands firsthand how overwhelming the autism journey can be. His focus isn't on adding more noise. It's on helping parents gain clarity, confidence, and a practical path forward. Through his coaching and guidance, Lynn helps parents cut through the noise, sort through conflicting advice, and make decisions with greater confidence. The goal isn't to tell you what to think. It's to help you navigate your family's unique situation with greater certainty and purpose. Lynn offers a free strategic clarity call where you can discuss your family's challenges, explore opportunities for growth, and identify meaningful next steps. To learn more or schedule your free call, visit elevatehowyounavigate.com. Because when parents have clarity, they can navigate with confidence, and that can make all the difference in the world. First, I would like to mention MyU Water. If you're trying to upgrade your hydration, MyU uses a vortex flow system that mimics how water naturally moves in rivers and streams. That motion helps increase oxygenation and release unwanted gases like chlorine, improving overall water quality and making it easier to stay consistently hydrated. But here's what most people overlook. Hydration isn't just about water. It's about minerals and absorption. MyU allows you to remineralize your water with essential minerals and electrolytes, supporting cellular hydration, energy levels, and overall physiological balance. When your water has the right structure and mineral content, your body can actually use it more efficiently. If you care about hydration, performance, or just feeling better day to day, this is one of those simple upgrades that adds up. You can get 10% off with the code AUTISM. Next, Daylight Computer Company and Daylight Kids. These devices are designed to work with your brain, not against it. And honestly, the future of tech is already here. Most screens are built for stimulation, bright, fast, and attention-grabbing. But that often leads to eye strain, mental fatigue, and disrupted sleep. Daylight takes a different approach. By reducing blue light and lowering your overall sensory load, these devices support sustained focus, calmer attention, and healthier sleep patterns. For anyone who feels drained after screen time, or for kids whose nervous systems are still developing, this creates a much more natural, regulated way to engage with technology. If you want your tech to support your brain instead of overstimulating it, this is worth checking out. Use code AUTISM for $50 off. And finally, Chroma Light devices, lights designed for humans. Natural light contains a full spectrum that our brains and bodies are tuned to. But most modern indoor lighting falls short of that. It's often narrow, harsh, and out of sync with how we're designed to experience light. Chroma is built to bring that balance back. These lights are designed to better reflect the qualities of natural light, supporting your circadian rhythm, reducing sensory strain, and creating environments that feel calmer and more aligned. That can translate into better sleep, more stable energy, and a nervous system that isn't constantly being pushed toward overload. If you have ever felt off under certain lighting and didn't know why, this is worth exploring. Get 10% off with the code AUTISM. If you're optimizing your environment, your focus, your well-being, your nervous system, these products are worth checking out.